McBride, and I am the Marketing Program Manager at the National Restaurant Association. I'll be your host for today's webinar. For any reporters on this call, questions and follow-up inquiries can be directed to Vanessa Sink at thesink@restaurant.org. A few housekeeping items. Before we get started, know that today's session will be about 45 minutes long with ample time for questions at the end. To ask a question, simply submit it to the Q&A box on your screen. We'll address your questions at the end of the presentation and get through as many as time permits. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email with a link to the on-demand presentation where you can rewatch or share with a colleague. At the end of today's session, you'll be prompted to provide your feedback in a short survey. Please take 1 minute to complete this survey as it provides us with valuable information regarding your thoughts on the presentation and how we can produce more great content for you in the future. Next, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. From the National Restaurant Association, joining us, we have Aaron Frazier, our Director of Healthcare and Tax Policy, as well as Sean Kennedy, Executive Vice President of Public Affairs. Aaron and Sean's contact information and bios can be found in the speaker info box on the right side of your screen. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's presentation. And Sean, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Carly. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sean Kennedy with the National Restaurant Association. Appreciate everybody joining us here today. I'm really the opening act, which I'm happy to be for Aaron Frazier before we get to the main event. I want to provide a quick update, though, just on how we got here, what else has happened along the past 12 months, and where do we go here as an association. We're at an unfortunate bit of an anniversary. March 14th, 2020 was the 1 year anniversary, 1 year mark, so to speak, of when indoor dining shutdowns began, Hoboken, New Jersey being the first community. 1 year later, we are holding a webinar on a significant $28.6 billion recovery fund for the restaurant industry. We'll find out later from Aaron the timing on when that kind of thing has come out, but I want to talk for just a second about how we got here and some of the other things that we've been focused on over the past year. Really, the be-all, end-all of our ability to engage as a National Restaurant Association here in D.C. is our relationship with our 50 state partners, Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. Our state restaurant association partners allow us to represent a hyper-local industry. If you're not a member of your state restaurant association, please make an effort to do so. If you can either Google your state restaurant association name or Council of State restaurantassociations.org, we'll have more information on that. Looking at how we reached, some issues with my slides on my side here, I apologize. Looking at how we reached the past year of accomplishments. On March 8th, we recognized that something was incredibly wrong, so to speak, with where we were going as an industry. On March 18th, we wrote congressional leaders to urge for comprehensive action. We have had a lot of wins along the way that have led up to this. What's been clear in Washington is that they move incrementally. They do not do big things overnight. The Restaurant Revitalization Fund was going to be over 1 year in the making. We recognized that and really took an all-of-the-above approach. Going through this list really quick, obviously the Paycheck Protection Program, everybody knows this one well. The PPP is not a perfect solution for the restaurant industry, but we got it in a way that allowed restaurants to take better use of it. The second round of PPP increased how much local restaurants could apply for. Most small businesses were 2 times their monthly payroll. Restaurants were able to secure 3.5 times. We, the National Restaurant Association, created a restaurant employee relief fund. Partnering with celebrity chef Guy Fieri, we created a fund with zero overhead. Every dollar that was raised went straight into the hands of displaced workers that gave grants to more than 43,000 restaurant workers. Cocktails to go in 32 states and Washington, D.C. This is the biggest change in alcohol laws since Prohibition. really, how do we just, again, take an all-of-the-above approach to relief? How do we find ways to allow restaurants to maintain some source of revenue, some source of income and profit while they're dealing with a takeout and delivery model? And we've already pivoted, and our state restaurant association partners they're obviously the leaders on this one, but all of them are working towards, for those 32 states, or if we can expand it, how do we make those permanent moving forward? A big concern on PPP was that the Trump administration said that PPP would be considered income. You'd be paying taxes on that. That represented $15.7 billion in tax liability for restaurants and hotels. Surprise tax bills are the worst thing that an industry like ours could have right now. We pushed for legislation which cleared the House, which cleared the Senate, which represented Congress rolling the Trump administration. Remember, it was a Republican Congress, it was a Republican Senate at that period, in order to get that through. A huge effort, but a huge one that's really going to pay off come tax time for operators. The Employee Retention Tax Credit, you've heard Aaron talk about this in the past. We pushed to expand how it works, enhance how it works. Because of our work together with you, with our SRA partners, restaurants can now receive up to $19,000 per eligible employee across 2020 and 2021. Obviously, restaurant relief is going to be important, but what really matters is when can we see indoor dining capacity limits at a point that allow restaurants to be sustainable. We have a 50-state play on this, as well as DC and Puerto Rico, working with our SRA partners to provide that guidance, coordinating with CDC, coordinating with the federal government, and pressing for rational approaches that will allow us to resume something approaching normal indoor dining. And then last, we've been talking about business interruption insurance. We have some wins, some losses on the board, but we're not letting go on this one yet. Business interruption insurance, so many restaurants have been paying their premiums for decades, haven't seen the relief that they should have gotten from this. We have filed amicus briefs through the Restaurant Law Center, which is part of the National Restaurant Association, in every federal appellate court that has heard any cases yet. We're not letting go of this. There are a lot more actions that we can talk you through, but really one of the capstones, one of the largest ones, is the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. You're going to hear that obviously from Aaron. If you are not part of the Restaurants Act community, please join us. Please go to www.restaurantsact.com. You'll see also in here we have an ad for our 2021 Public Affairs Conference. We do this every year. This will be our 35th conference. It's where we bring together restaurant operators, policy leaders, Washington power players, all from around the country, to talk about what are the issues that we need to be focusing on. And it's going to be more than just relief, because we are going to get through this and we're going to get through the recovery funds. We are still going to have a long road to recovery ahead of us. We're going to need active engagement at the federal, state, and local level. We have not released our list of speakers. It's going to be a virtual conference like everything is this year, but it's going to be incredibly dynamic, incredibly worthy of your time, and I hope you'll stay on it. Last, Restaurants Act today, restaurantsact.com. On our homepage has a tab specifically for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. We are loading it with the fact sheets, with the webinars, with information that you need. There's going to be a lot more to come on this. We're going to have FAQ documents. Once the application is up, Aaron will be giving another webinar on that front. And then on the homepage is registration information for the Public Affairs Conference. But let me kick it over to the main event. Aaron Frazier is our Director of Healthcare and Tax Policy, has been focused on PPP, RRF, ERTC, the entire alphabet soup on recovery and dollars and cents. He's really been working overtime and is an expert on everything RRF related. We are going to do Q&A at the end of this. Please type your questions in here. We will try to give a representative sample of them that Shannon Mead and I will pitch to Aaron at the very end. So with that, Aaron, thanks. Let me kick it over to you.
Thanks, Sean. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sean, and thank you so much for the great attendance that we have today. We had our last webinar on March 4th, which I guess was just about 11 days ago. But what a great update just to provide in the last 11 days. On March 11th, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan into law that included the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which really has a tremendous grant program for restaurants. We've been pressing for this direct restaurant-specific relief since March 18th of last year. We knew then that restaurants closing down due to COVID-19 would mean tremendous losses in our workforce, in our communities, and for small businesses that make up the vast, vast majority of this industry. At that time, we asked for a $145 billion restaurant and food service industry recovery fund. We knew that there were going to be over $200 billion in losses if you had a 3-month closure in the restaurant industry. And back then, it was, let's slow the spread. Let's crush the curve. Let's have this temporary period where we can get us through to summer, where we think that there might be a little bit of an improvement in the COVID-19 spread. We didn't know how tough of a year it was going to be back then, but we did know that we needed major restaurant-specific relief because this is such a unique business model. And you knew that. You on the phone right now knew that as well. So while it is a sad anniversary that's commemorated with RRF, we are nonetheless very excited about these developments. We called for it not only in March, but then we worked through the CARES Act. We worked through PPP. We improved PPP to make it workable. We worked through the employee retention tax credits, as Sean noted. We worked and released a blueprint for restaurant revival in July, saying, okay, that was our first pass at relief, but we really need to dig in. And first part of that, restaurant-specific grants that we need to sustain this vital, second biggest private sector workforce in the country. And we need to do it through the Restaurants Act that was introduced and championed with a capital C by Senators Roger Wicker of Mississippi and Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. And we really do mean that, champions that brought forward this idea of a $120 billion restaurant relief grant program. And they did it the right way with great co-sponsors, over half the Senate, and got really far with it. Unfortunately, it didn't pass at the end of last year, but it really did create the conditions going into early 2021 in January, where we successfully introduced a bipartisan unified bill in Congress that would set the stage for where we have step 2 in the Restaurant Revitalization Fund of $28.6 billion. That is now law. So while it's not the same thing as the Restaurants Act, it's not $120 billion. It is not situated the exact same way as the Restaurants Act. In some ways, there are improvements. In some ways, there are setbacks. But this is a huge, huge step forward and a huge win for restaurants. And we are thrilled to begin working through the implementation. There's a lot of details that we need to work out. What we know is about 5 pages long. If you do as the team does and you put it into Microsoft Word and you chew over it 3 dozen times between March 4th and now, there are a lot of changes that are going to be made and improvements and a lot of detail. And we're going to work really closely with our State Restaurant Association partners and with restaurants on what those changes need to be with the Small Business Administration. And step 3, we do think due to that incredible demand in our industry, there will likely need to be more appropriations. But just as we did in March of 2020 when we called for a restaurant recovery fund, we need to set the foundation well. We need to make this program look efficient, seamless, and ensure that there's a really great foundation to build on. So as the concept became a bill and it was compromised and it's become a reality, it's important to see right now who's in and who's out. And this was a great question that we received 11 days ago. So we just wanted to put it up there very cleanly for people to see who's in and who's out. When we look at who's in, there's really, I think, 3 pillars. And I think it's the restaurant and the food service locations where people go to eat. And then I think it's the bars and saloons and tap rooms and taverns. And then it's kind of the third part that is a little more undefined, and that I think is like the ins that I think may need a little bit more clarification. And that's something that we're already focused on. How do we build that out? How do we suggest language with SBA and ensure that we know exactly what that means to ensure that the people that have sustained these losses are going to be eligible under this program? And who's out? I think it's a little bit cleaner. Publicly traded companies, restaurants with over 20 locations, together with affiliated businesses, regardless of multiple or different operating names. Companies who have applied for a shuttered venue operator grant. That's the program specifically for movie theaters, performing arts, and other venues, or state or local government operated businesses. Again, the RRF is targeting restaurants that have less than 21 locations. Less than 21 locations that lost money in 2020. So generally, it is going to focus on the smaller restaurants. There is a $10 million cap in the amount of a grant that a restaurant can receive, and there's a cap on a per physical location restaurant of $5 million. And the messaging matters here. We're already hearing about how the administration, who's overseeing the program, is looking at this program. As we mentioned before, restaurants, 9 out of 10 of restaurants are small businesses. 7 out of 10 of restaurants are single unit operations. So when they're looking at this program, the priority is going to be delivering equitable relief to hard-hit small businesses. We've heard that messaging being delivered pretty continuously already. On the White House, when they talk about the American Rescue Plan, when they talk about RRF, this is the way they do it on the sun. This graphic on the left-hand side of your screen. It's a graphic from someone named Chris, who's a small restaurant owner, who was actually unable to access PPP. The parameters of PPP, maybe they didn't have relationships to their lender, they didn't have those traditional banking relationships, whatever. Maybe they were open too late for PPP because PPP had that cutoff of February 15th or earlier in 2020. For whatever reason, they were unavailable to access PPP. But now under this program, they would be able to access an RRF grant. And even when Senate Majority Leader Schumer, who is a co-sponsor of the Restaurants Act and a very strong advocate for the RRF, his summary that he sent within his caucus, it cites the National Restaurant Association's data about losses in the industry, about how about 1 out of every 6 restaurants has closed over the past 12 months, and that we've lost about 2.4 million jobs. But he focuses on the most acute losses, the small mom and pop restaurants that have lost about $135 billion in sales of last year. So he says even while PPP has offered assistance to restaurants, the significant need is there, especially for smaller restaurants. So that's where the focus is going to be seen. I think we're going to see a lot of that messaging when we start seeing the program being rolled out, and even how the SBA is going to write some of the rules. So it's important to, what's some of the back of the envelope math? What would this grant look like for one of these smaller operators? So if we took an example of a restaurant that received both PPP draws and suffered losses in 2020, and they kind of had that average revenue category. They made around $1.2 million in 2019 as a single unit restaurant in 2019, and then they lost money in 2020. How much could they get in RRF? The key term there is pandemic-related revenue losses. And this restaurant that we made up, Fraser's Flapjacks, they earned $1.2 million, and they had a $400,000 payroll. Between both draws of PPP, they received about $200,000. So because of the way that the RRF is written, you have to deduct your PPP loans from your otherwise eligible RRF grant amount. Now, under the Restaurants Act, now there's a separate thing, the Restaurants Act, that's still a proposed, that is still legislation, not law. They actually also deduct your idle loan, your loan. The RRF does not do that. The law does not do that. So that's a good thing. That was a good development for restaurants, not to see their idle loans being deducted from RRF grant totals. But here's a scenario. For 2020, if Fraser's Flapjacks lost 50% of their gross receipts in 2020, you would take the $600,000 they lost, you would subtract whatever they received in PPP, and you would roughly arrive at a $400,000 RRF grant. So that would be a pretty good thing for Fraser's Flapjacks if they're otherwise eligible to receive this money. And then you can kind of cascade down to the rest of the total. If in 2020 they lost 40% and they lost $480,000, they would receive $280,000. In 2020, if they lost if they lost 30%, they would lose $360,000. They would be eligible for $160,000. So that's kind of how it would keep going down for the otherwise eligible amount. If you lost 15%, so if your threshold for losses for 2020 went down to that amount, hypothetically, you would not be eligible for an RRF grant. So that's kind of where the push comes to shove and where you would be eligible for RRF. If somehow, through PPP, you received enough money that you would not be otherwise eligible. So going on to the strings attached to the dollars under PPP, we make a lot of comparisons to PPP because under RRF, we've seen some surprises, and we've heard of some surprises from members who didn't expect that there would be any constraints under the expenses for RRF grants. They thought grants, and they thought that you could spend the money on whatever they would see fit. But actually, there are buckets of eligible expenses that you must spend it on, which we think might mean you have to spend your RRF grant on these categories of eligible expenses. And it's very similar to second draw of PPP. As you can see, payroll, rent, mortgage interest, operational expenses. These are all things that are very similar to second draw eligible expenses under PPP, are also for RRF. Now, RRF is pretty good because you can actually cover normal food and beverage inventory. So that's a big advantage. But under second draw PPP, you could refinance an idle, and you could also cover property damage costs related to public disturbances in 2020. So there are some things that aren't overlapping, but in general, I think the biggest takeaway there that I wanted to note for people is the oversight component that is probably still going to exist under RRF. This might mean that there are still going to be reports for PPP, for RRF expenses. Just because it's a grant doesn't mean that there still won't be accountability and oversight under those expenses. And there still might be reports on what you're spending this money on under RRF for your grants. And, we're trying to work on the timeline. We're trying to make sure that this is a really efficient process, and the structure and the oversight is as clean as possible. We want to make sure that the potholes that we saw in PPP implementation are kind of paved over for restaurants when they're beginning to anticipate this process, the applications, and really prepare the right way. This has gone really fast, and I think everyone can understand how quickly the need has demanded this process to go fast. If things worked out really, really quickly, the SBA could release rules and applications as soon as next month. After that, there is a 21-day priority for women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and those businesses that are owned by socially and economically disadvantaged Americans. And that process could begin as early as May or June. And also in May and June, then the RRF could open for all other eligible restaurants under that same time period. That would be a very, very fast implementation time period. The good news is that we have some great champions, lawmakers. Our SRAs are in touch with people on this program. Restaurants are in touch with people on this program. But again, we want to make sure that this program is built the right way and that the infrastructure is very sound, so that then we're not going to have the same issues as the implementation gets set. So, how can we make this more efficient? How can we help everyone get ready? Let's get into that. Preparing for RRF. So, one of the first things we can do is see what were some potholes that have already existed. One of my favorite sayings is that trailblazers can get burned, but settlers prosper. The RRF playbook, I make a lot of allusions and analogies to PPP, but the RRF playbook is really the Shuttered Venues Operator Grant Program that was signed into law on December 27th of 2020, so about 2.5 months ago. It's a grant program specifically designed by SBA for movie theaters, venues, performing arts centers, because they've been, as the program suggests, shuttered venues for over a year. And it's been extremely challenging for them to operate. It became law in December 27th. It's well-funded with over $16 billion, and they just received a little bit more money from the American Rescue Plan. But the application process has still not opened yet up, and an eligible business has yet to receive a single dollar. So if that's not a cold splash of water, then I don't know what is. Because just last week, we heard from an SBA spokesperson that the application is probably going to be opened up in early April. And that was a big development. So for us, when we're trying to say that we want RRF to open up in a matter of weeks, we have to keep in mind that there is a process that takes place. It's extremely important to get it right. And our friends at the shuttered venues are months in the making. Now, we know that there's been a lot of transition between December and March in Washington, D.C. There's a new president, there's a new administration. We're going to have a new SBA administrator in a matter of days. Administrator Isabel Guzman from California is going to take helm of this. And we know that RRF is going to be an administration priority. It's part of their 100-day economic agenda. We're going to learn from SBO and the problems from SBO. We're going to make an omelet from these broken eggs. So that's the opportunity, and that's something we really want to work on and make sure it goes right. Well, I'll draw your attention to the bottom of this little chart about how our entity is going to prepare. And all indications are showing us that it's going to be the same way. We're going to prepare the same way between SBO and RRF. And that's really what we want to lay out for folks today. And how do we prepare? How do we what is a DUNS number? What is SAM? And how can we get ready for implementation? So 3 steps we're preparing for RRF, especially as we're in this interim period this month. 3 things. Sign up for a data universal numbering system, or a DUNS number. DUNS. This is free. I'll say it again. It's free. It can take up to 2 business days. But there's this company called Dun & Bradstreet that provides this service. Number 2, after you get a DUNS number, register with the U.S. federal government system for award management. So register with sam.gov. This is also free, and it can take you up to 2 weeks to process it. And then the 3rd step is you send SAM a notarized letter, or send a SAM notarized letter to the Federal Service Desk, or FSD, and you have to send this letter within 60 days of your registration with SAM. This is a new security procedure, but it's something that you have to do once you register with SAM. So let's get into these 3 steps. Number 1, what is a DUNS number? And I think I've been trying to research it a lot because I never heard about it last month as a lot of you probably hadn't. It's really just a 9-digit unique identifier number for your business. It's a way for other organizations to identify other businesses. It's like a fingerprint for your business. It allows a lot of businesses that don't know each other to recognize each other. I went on YouTube, and there's a lot of good explainers and tutorials about how businesses utilize their DUNS number. There was this great case study from Pork Barrel Barbecue. If you're a fan of Shark Tank, they got an investment from Barbara Corcoran, but then there's also this tutorial about how they use their DUNS number to talk to grocery stores about getting their barbecue sauce on the shelves. So it's one of those things that it sounded a little bit mystifying, but it's actually a very common business-to-business operating code that is used in a lot of different formats. If you are getting a DUNS number just for RRS, then I suspect a lot of you are. If you just want to get a DUNS number for RRS, when you log on to the website, which is right there in the footer of this slide, and again, the slide, the presentation, the recording, this will all be available for you on our website, restaurantsact.com/RRF. So all of this will be on our website. But if you're interested in getting your DUNS number only for the grant program, only for the RRF grant registration, then when you go into your primary reason for DUNS number registration, and this is where I have the big red arrow, you'll put in, I'm a U.S. government contractor or grantee. We confirmed that with counsel over the weekend to make sure that it's a streamlined process for you when you get there. The other alternative is I'm a U.S. business seeking contracts. But if you're looking for a grant, if you're looking for RRS, do it this way. I'm a U.S. government contractor or grantee when you're registering for your DUNS number. So step 2, connecting with sam.gov. Once you get your DUNS number, which again will take up to about 2 days, restaurants need an active System of Award Management account, a SAM account. To sign up, entities have to create a login.gov user account to access or register for SAM. On the My SAM page, you have to register as a new entity and select your type of entity, your type of business. Again, if you're registering in SAM.gov strictly for RRF, again, you're there, I'm there ready to register for a grant. That's why you're there. There's a question that's going to ask you, why are you registering this entity, your entity, to do business with the U.S. government? You will select, I only want to apply for federal assistance opportunities like grants, loans, and other financial assistance programs in response to that question. So that's what you'll do. Don't go down other rabbit holes. Keep your eyes on the prize and just register for that opportunity. And this is the same step. When you get to the core data section, it's going to get a little bit more, I'm not going to say complex, but it's going to get a little bit more information from you. Not only are they're going to try to validate your DUNS information, they're going to get into your tax ID, they're going to get into your business type and organizational structure, and they're going to get into your bank information, your electronic funds transfer information for federal government payout purposes. As you can imagine, if you're expecting to receive a grant, that's how they're going to pay you. So they have to have that information. That's how the grant is going to be received. Keep in mind, this is not a bank-driven process. This isn't a lender-driven process. This is coming straight from the federal government. So this is how you're going to have to interact with the federal government if you're hoping to win an award. Again, this isn't like PPP when the bank is kind of the buffer between you and SBA. You're going to be working directly with the federal government when you're applying and trying to get these loans. So when you're answering these questions, this is the process that you're going to have to go through. And this is the information that you're going to enter into this portal. Also, and we have to stress this, we have to triple underline this, be very diligent. All of this information is going to plant the seeds for your overall eligibility. when you're entering the points of contact section, this is crucial because this information is going to be used for the government to contact you about the awards. They have to know about all the other different registrations. They have to know about your DUNS number. They have to know about the information that you submitted throughout your application. They have to be aware of the totality of what you're applying for. They have to know about your gross receipts as well when you're entering your gross receipts information between 2019 and 2020. So they have to have a whole picture of the business when they're applying for this information. When you finally get to that final representations and certifications, remember, this is a federal government program. This is taxpayer money. There are going to be guardrails. There's going to be oversight. So be very diligent about what you're submitting. When you submit, you'll have a registration submitted confirmation message flashing on your screen. And then within 2 weeks, you'll get your information back from SAM about the success of what you submitted and your SAM registration information. So that's the process there on sam.gov. Again, these slides will be available. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of step-by-step process. And we'll have more information available so you can kind of go through it in your own time. But it's important just to understand the process you're about to go through when you're pursuing these loans. Step 3, I was surprised that we need a notary letter, but I think this is a new security policy that was put into place over the last 3 years over at SAM. But they do require a notary letter. So within 60 days of a new account being set up, a signed notary letter must be submitted. They provide 2 templates, and you insert your own business letterhead, or you type in your own business letterhead. You have to sign. Someone with business authority has to sign the letter in the presence of a notary, according to your state's notary procedures. And it's important to sign and scan and do all the things that are important to submit it to the Federal Service Desk. You create a service ticket, you attach a scanned letter, you have to enter in your business type, your DUNS number, and all the other information that is required before you send in that notarized letter. It's extremely important to get that part right, because you don't want to trip up on a notarized letter before you submit in that very important information at the end. This should be the easiest part of it, but again, let's just make sure that you get that last part right on the notarized letter. Let's remember, the ink is still drying on this process, though. Would I go out and get a notarized letter tomorrow? No, I wouldn't. These processes are not guarantees yet. There's going to be different oversight or new oversight because this is a new program, and we're still navigating exactly what the steps will be. This is a projection of what I would do. I would be getting a DUNS number. That's number one of what I would do. And I would be getting familiar with sam.gov. That's what I would be doing this month. Pause before you sign up with any vendor who pledges that they know how to shepherd a business through the process. Again, it's a new program led by an agency that has never done it. SBA has been around since the 50s. They've never set up a $28 billion grant program before. They've never done it. They're still learning how to do it. So if someone says I'm a vendor that knows exactly how to do this and how to shepherd you through this, look, they don't, because no one's done this before. Your SRA partners, National Restaurant Association, we're going to provide a lot of these step-by-step resources so that we can all work through it together. RRF is going to be a high-profile program with a lot of regulatory and legislative scrutiny. So that's why we have to make sure that SBA provides the right information to make this as easy as possible. That's why when we talk to them about how the applications are going to be working, what the process is going to look like, we ask for not only the plain English version, but give us the plain Spanish version. Give us the plain Japanese version. Give us the plain Korean version. Let's have a lot of different languages that reflect the communities that we serve. Because we know that we have diverse communities, we have diverse memberships, and that we need to make sure that we have a good step-by-step process for every restaurant operator that desperately needs relief coming out of the pandemic. So these are all the things that we're working with SBA on a day-by-day basis to make sure that your process as a restaurateur that needs relief is a little bit easier, or at least more efficient with your limited time. And there is free help that's available. If you need help registering at SAM, you can contact the Federal Service Desk at fsd.gov. So you can get a DUNS number that should be relatively, knock on wood, relatively painless, and then you can get help registering in SAM. After that, we might need more guidance for a step after that, but that's all part of the process. So next up, we did want to talk a little bit more about how to balance your PPP and ERTC as we're waiting for more information on RRF to come out. Again, RRF, there's still a timeline for implementation to come out. We're going to be waiting from SBA. We may not hear anything for the rest of the month from SBA. The window for PPP is still closing, but there's still some time for PPP, and there's other planning measures we can take for immediate restaurant relief, because we know that this business it's a challenge on day by day as much as it is month by month. So overall, PPP continues to be a record program. As Sean mentioned, restaurants and hotels have received over $72 billion over the past 12 months. We've received almost $30 billion in PPP just this year in PPP second draw loans. We're the number one sector in PPP. As you know, restaurants and hotels have a 3.5 multiplier in those loan amounts. So that's been a real big success for a lot of restaurants. If you're waiting on whether or not you should apply for a PPP second draw or wait for an RRF grant, I would seriously think about what is available right now for PPP second draw. Because the RRF grant program, keep in mind, the implementation is still rolling out. The shuttered venue operators grant program was authorized in late December, and the applications may not be going live until April. So there's a timeline, there's a runway that you have to consider, and PPP is live right now. Currently, it's live right now, but it's set to expire by the end of the month, about 2 weeks. There's still about $137 billion remaining in the program. The association team and other groups were asking Congress to extend the lending window by 2 months. We're advocating for the PPP Extension Act that would take that window from March 31st until the end of May, because we think a lot of small businesses, including a lot of restaurants, have seen some holds. They've seen a lot of some red tape hold up their applications for second draw loans, and we want to make sure that they get the money that they're eligible for and that their employees can remain on payroll. That's been a big focus of ours. So again, PPP expires at the end of the month, but we're trying to push that an additional 2 months. But it's for a limited time only. Next up, employee retention game changer. In the American Rescue Plan, the employee retention tax credit was extended up until the end of the year, the end of 2021. That would add an additional 2 calendar quarters of employee retention tax credits for an eligible business. Employers with up to 500 employees would be eligible all year, all 2021. And that's a huge deal. All an employer has to do is hit one of 2 criteria. Number 1, full or partial closure orders or capacity restrictions, or a significant decline in gross receipts. That can be as small as a 20% decline across the calendar quarter in 2021 when compared to the same quarter in 2019. Of course, ERTC, there's already a restriction in that you can't take a tax credit on any payroll that you meet with RRF. So if you do get a grant in the spring or summer through RRF and you use it to pay payroll, you can't take ERTC. So that's something for more long-term planning for later on this year. But again, ERTC being eligible for the rest of the year is a big deal in the American Rescue Plan, and we're really excited to see that happen. More resources are coming at restaurantsact.com/RRF. We really encourage you to bookmark that page. That's going to be updated as often as we can. Webinar recordings, fact sheets, more information about what is the DUNS number, how to register at SAM.gov. More information will be uploaded there, and we really appreciate everyone being on today's webinar. We know we want to get to Q&A, so right now I'm going to open it up and see what we have.
Thanks, Aaron. A lot of questions going back to the DUNS number. For operators that already have DUNS numbers, do they need to refile? Do they need to put in that they are looking for a DUNS number with the grantee designation, or can they move on to SAM with the DUNS number that they're already using?
My understanding is that if you already have a DUNS number, you do not have to go back and get a new one. That is still your unique identifier. And you can pivot from with your existing DUNS number and go to SAM.gov. You've kind of already hit step one.
Got it. And then before I hand off to Shannon, lots of questions in the queue with folks asking about their individual business, if they're not a restaurant per se, but they're a caterer, things like that. All of that is answered in our 2-page document that's just an issue brief, an explainer on how the Restaurant Revitalization Fund works. That can be found at restaurantsact.com/RRF. Let me hand it over to Shannon Mead, our Vice President of Policy, for the next question.
Thanks, Sean.
To Sean's point, we're live with slide 10 right now that does have the caterers and other types of businesses that are included in the RRF grant program. Sorry, Shannon, go ahead.
Yeah, Aaron, let's go back to the DUNS number just for a moment, because it's really important to get this underway and get this started, because it's a really critical part of the process here. But this is a really good question. If you don't have a DUNS number and you need to register for that number, do you register as your corporate number, or you're doing business as? What's your advice there?
That's a great question.
For purposes of the restaurant, for purposes of registering your DUNS number for the grant. Do we know that? If we don't know that, we can follow back.
Yeah, that's going to have to be something we're going to look at guidance on and get some more information on.
Okay, to this question, we will follow back with you on that. Next question, Sean.
Aaron, what is the interplay as far as PPP, as folks are looking to see what they can get for RRF? Actually, I'm going to ask you a 2-part question. One, a lot of folks are asking about using RRF to cover expenses that they've already incurred for their restaurant in 2020. So if they made improvements, if they have debt, can they use the RRF grants? Can they use those proceeds to pay back that spoiled inventory, things like that? Or is it only for forward-looking expenses? Actually, I'm just going to leave it with that 1-part question.
Yeah, that's a great question to everyone on the call, because they all know the debt that is piled up because of all the other expenses that have taken place over the past year. Eligible expenses under the RRF are those incurred from February 15th, 2020 to December 31st, 2021. And that can be altered by the SBA, but I think it's going to be broadened by the SBA. They're not going to tighten that window. But generally, yes, it can go back and meet expenses that were incurred from February 15th of 2020 until the end of 2021. Yes.
Great.
Aaron, a question with respect to new starts in 2020. Has the SBA released the formula to use for new restaurants that opened in 2020 to calculate the amount of their eligibility? We know the answer is no, because we know the SBA has yet to release any guidance yet. But Aaron, can you speak to how the eligibility with respect to new starts in 2020?
Yes, and that's a great question. It was in the law. We actually tried to illustrate that on our March 4th webinar. So if I was a new restaurant, I would go back to restaurantsact.com/RRF and find that webinar where we kind of detail it more, and our fact sheet where we lay this out a little bit. But for everyone on the call who can't reach back there now, if you didn't open for the entirety of 2019, and you're wondering how do I calculate my loss from 2019 to 2020 for my full RRS amount, what you would do is you would take your average monthly gross receipts from 2019, and then you would multiply it by 12 to extrapolate what your average gross receipts for 2019 would be. And then you would subtract your average monthly receipts from 2020 would be from that total. So you would still get your total from 2019 and then subtract 2020 from that. So you'd still be able to get your full RRF grant from the difference between what you would expect for 2020.
Thanks very much.
Aaron,
great answer.
Aaron, can you clarify how PPP counts against you, or where the amount of a forgiven PPP loan counts in as restaurants are anticipating how much they can apply for from the RRF?
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction that you just made there, Sean. You used the word forgiven, and unfortunately, that term is not used in the law, in the RRF law. So it's the word received is in RRS. So it doesn't have to be forgiven. It's not about forgiven funds. It's just about what you received under PPP first draw in 2020 or what you received in second draw in PPP. So it's the totality of whatever money you received in PPP is subtracted from your otherwise eligible RRF grant amount. So I'm going to pull up the slide where we tried to do the back of the envelope math on that, because the forgiveness is not included in the deduction amount. It is only the money you received from SBA under the PPP loans. And just to illustrate that real quick, when we were doing the estimates of what a business that earned $1.2 million in 2019 and they lost $600,000, they lost around 50% of their gross receipts in 2020. So hypothetically, they should be able to get an RRF grant of $600,000 in 2021. But across 2 rounds of PPP, they received $200,000. So instead of $600,000 of a grant, they have to subtract the $200,000 in totality of the 2 PPP loans that they received. It doesn't matter whether or not they were forgiven. It doesn't matter whether or not they put them all on payroll or took some as a loan. It just matters that they received 2 different PPP loans, and they have to subtract both of those from their otherwise eligible RRF grant amount.
Next question, Aaron. This is an eligibility question, and a good question. We've got a situation. One question on one hand is the grant available for a restaurant that had to close permanently due to the pandemic? And on the other side of that coin is a similar question. If the restaurant is still closed but awaiting that reopening, planning to reopen soon, are they eligible for this grant? So it's a permanent closure situation versus a waiting to reopen situation with respect to eligibility. Can you talk about that?
That's a good question. That is not specified in the legislation, so we would have to ask SBA about what we would do to a restaurant that is temporarily closed or fully closed, and whether or not they would be able to access funds to service debt obligations, or would it be able to, if it's in hibernation, would it be able to use those funds to reopen? That's something we would need to bake out in regulations. And I think especially if we can get that kind of feedback to our state restaurant association partners, that would be really helpful to see what the timing looks like and what the funds look like when we look at 2019 versus 2020.
Thank you.
Aaron, how are the 20 unit number? Is that based on how many units how many restaurants are in operation or owned now in 2021? Is it how many they owned in 2020? Is it how many they owned before the pandemic? Do we have guidance on that?
Yes, we do. The date is as of March 13th. Own or operate 20 or fewer establishments. The eligible entity has to own or operate 20 or fewer establishments with their affiliated businesses as of March 13th, 2020.
One other follow-up one. Where are, can folks, as far as changes, two specific things came up that aren't addressed in our two-pager that I was curious of. Number one, can someone use RRF proceeds to pay off an idle loan? And second, we talk about our two-pager specifically says that expanding outdoor dining capacity is a permitted use. Could changes be made to improve socially distanced options for indoor dining? So I have one restaurant operator has a lot of communal tables. If they want to break that down and break that up into smaller tables, are interior changes permitted right now under the scope as the bill was passed?
Those are all really good questions, and the reason why we didn't have them in our fact sheet is because it was an artful dodge. It's because it wasn't specific in the legislation. In the legislation, when they have maintenance, it says specific construction to accommodate outdoor seating, so we included that. It didn't say maintenance specifically including construction for indoor seating to accommodate social distancing, so we couldn't include that. The second part of that question was also good. It was about addressing idle debt. So it doesn't have, PPP second draw allows you to refinance your idle, but there is not similar language under RRF. So I'm suspicious that language was not included about refinancing or addressing previous debt obligations in an explicit way. I would hope that there would be more flexibility for restaurants that incur debt obligations, but that is something that we have not seen explicitly within the legislation.
We need to begin to wrap up. I want to note that there's a lot that SBA needs to figure out. Congress specifically left a lot of questions unanswered. A lot of the questions are reflected in this. Congressional legislation only goes so far in directing SBA or in directing any government agency how they're going to run it. The rules of the road, the frequently asked questions, the nature of the application, those are all things where Congress is going to give deference to the experts at SBA. What we are speaking to is what we know based on the black letter law. On things like the DUNS and SAM, that's based on our assumption from SBA, based on the fact that the program is probably going to be very similar to the Shuttered Venues program. There's a lot in common between the Restaurants Act, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and the Shuttered Venue program. So we are expecting that this is the case. The most common question we've gotten is, how do I apply? What's the website? And when can I apply? We don't have that guidance yet. We promise that we're going to be doing another webinar when we get the application to provide that. And then finally, we really appreciate all the questions that have been in here. We are working on sort of the ultimate frequently asked question directory. So if you haven't heard your question in here, if we get enough of them in your subject area, more is to come from us. So expect a lot more webinars, a lot more fact sheets, and a lot more engagement through our State Restaurant Association partners. Appreciate everybody's participation on this call. More to come. Let me hand it back over to Carla McBride for the closing housekeeping as far as if folks want to access this presentation moving forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. As we've mentioned a couple times throughout the presentation, this webinar recording will be sent to you by email for on-demand viewing, so you can rewatch or share with a colleague. Also, please take a moment to take that short survey so we can continue to provide you with webinar topics that are of interest to you. This concludes today's webinar. I'd like to give a big thank you to Aaron Fraser and Sean Kennedy and those folks monitoring our Q&A for all their great information, and thank you to all of you for attending. We look forward to engaging with you on future virtual events.
Thank you.